Welcome to the Anthropology After Data Management Roundtable. I'd like to thank the roundtable speakers, John Wilinski, Beate Erland, and Kim Fortin for coming, some of them coming from far away. At the EASA Executive Committee, we thought it was important to organize a conference on data, data archiving, data management plans, and on the whole, a new data mandates on the part of research councils and university administrators because of the types of challenges it presents to the social sciences and anthropology in particular. Now, the way I thought, the kind of conversation I thought it was important to open up was not just a conversation that addressed the specific challenges that our anthropology might face vis-a-vis the new policy directives and new funding requisites. How do we react to those things? But a broader conversation about the kind of research and intellectual practice that anthropology is today in a world where data is all around us and digital and archival practices in data management are happening whether we do them ourselves or not. So, and very briefly, to set the stage, to open up to frame the conversation, I thought I'd go through some dates and some examples of digital anthropological archives. I don't, by any means, I'm not going to go through, mine is not going to be a comprehensive survey of how anthropology has been doing archiving and digital archiving in the past. I just want to use some of these, which are very selective, to point and open up, to point to and open up some questions. So let me start by going back to 1998. In 1998, the Higher Education Funding Council in the UK funded the University of Kent's unit of anthropology and computing to run a series of experiments called Experience Reach Anthropology, the ERA, which were all about digitally archiving anthropological products. Now, one of the outcomes of this, for instance, was the migration, probably the first migration of an ethnographic archive, Paul Sterling's Turkish village fieldwork notes, to the internet. Well, that was one of the outcomes of it. Another outcome was Stephen Lyon's doctoral fieldwork. Whilst he was doing doctoral fieldwork, he addressed the challenge of what would it mean for him, for his ethnographic practice during fieldwork, to go online, right? What would it mean for him to produce the kinds of field notes that could, that could be published synchronously to, to the fieldwork he was doing, etc. Now, Stephen Lyon, who's today a professor of anthropology at Durham University, went on this experience, led him later on to develop actual software for anthropological archiving, coding practices, for instance, software for coding kinship relationships, etc. Around this time, 1998, Johannes Fabian decided to open up a website which he called the Language and Popular Culture in Africa database, where he started uploading, he ran a journal from that website, and he started uploading transcripts of ethnographic material, transcripts of interviews, of ritual observations, etc. And starting in parallel to uploading the material, starting experimenting with what he would later called ethnographic commentary. He already, by then, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, anticipated that playing with these still, at the time, kind of rudimentary archival technologies entailed a transformation, if not sort of a major overhaul of the genre of ethnographic recording and knowledge keeping and ethnographic sharing. So perhaps it's not surprising that just about that time, in her book, Property, Substance and Effect, Marilyn Strathern asked a question which has been at the center of the discipline probably ever since, which is, what is an ethnographic effect? How do we control and make visible what ethnography as a relational but also as an epistemic practice is all about? Right? So, and actually, although in passing, Strathern in the chapter in the book, in Property, Substance, Effect, when she raises this question, she hints at the internet as a space, a relational space, that suddenly destabilizes the notion of an ethnographic effect as something that is totally in control of the fieldwork and in his or her migration from the field scene, from the field site to the desk, right? So, late 1990s, all these questions about, how do we do ethnography in the age of the internet, what possibilities are opened up, what is an ethnographic effect, and so on. Now, this is the book, Ethnography as Commentary, that in 2008, Johannes Fabian published, sort of summarizing his reflections about the challenges and transformations that the virtual archive brought to the discipline. Now, move forward a couple of years, 2002, a number of scholars and institutions signed the Budapest Declaration on Open Access. As it turns out, there's one of the leading signatories of that declaration was an anthropologist, Leslie Chan. And I'll come back to Chan later. Also around that time, 2005, the AAA decided to task a group of people with thinking what the digital archiving did to archiving practices in anthropology. So anthropology has a long history of archiving in museums, in personal collections, but the physical object of the archive undergoes serious material, epistemic, and social transformations when it moves to when it becomes a digital object, right? So that task force, which is became the Registry of Anthropological Wiki, and actually the registry itself built on the work of the Council for the Preservation of Anthropological Records, which Seidel Silverman set up in 1995, right? So my point being here, it's simply being that there is a very long history of reflections, thinking through the challenges that archives present to the organization of anthropological knowledge, and also when those objects undergo material and epistemic transformation by becoming digital things. Now, 2005, 2006, still, around those dates, then a PhD student, Kimberly Kristen, working with Indigenous Aboriginal people in Australia, decides to design a digital archive that will allow for the curation, preservation, but also, crucially, the negotiation around ethical protocols of access to Indigenous ritual knowledge. So she sits down with her informants and imagines what would it take to build a digital archive where Indigenous people themselves decide the ritual protocols for accessing, clearing, licensing Indigenous ritual knowledge. Images, songs, designs, patterns, and so on. Over time, Kimberly Kristen's work led to the creation of Mukurtu, which is a software application, an open source software platform designed specifically for the needs of Indigenous communities. That's just one of the platforms that Kimberly and her group have developed. So we had the first sort of 1998, 2000, where anthropologists started experimenting with the internet, and the question of what an ethnographic effect is sort of started surfacing. 2002, 2006, when not only anthropologists take materials to the net, but actually start thinking about the net as an infrastructure of anthropological practice, as a field site itself, and the challenges that it opens up. And in that context, the question, I would say, that is brought to the fore is what kind of archive is a social relation? So I note the kind of slight displacement from what kind of social relation, what kind of social object an archive is, which that would be through the late 1990s question, to actually not shy now in the mid-2000s, not shying away from the fact that all social relationships are archival, material, and infrastructural in nature, and we need to bring those aspects to the fore and think about them seriously straight on. These are, in fact, questions, for instance, that were further pursued by people like Helen Veran, also working with indigenous Aboriginal people in Australia, or even Elizabeth Povinelli in the late 2009, 2010. Now, let me come back. I know I mentioned that in the year 2002, Leslie Chan signed the Budapest Declaration. It was one of the leading signatories of the Budapest Declaration of Open Access. Well, Leslie Chan, signed the declaration. It wasn't the only thing he did. Over the 2000s, he addressed the challenges that digital archiving presented, not as an archival practice, but as an anthropological practice, and quickly came to the realization that what was really, one of the things that was really at stake was redesigning the anthropological project as a collaborative infrastructural enterprise. So one of the things he did, he set up the Open Science Collaborative Infrastructure Project, which is, you've got a screenshot of the website here, which is funding fieldwork in with about the building of data repositories with indigenous people, local communities, activists, etc. And I'd like to, in this line of work, include, for example, the work that one of our speakers, Kim Fortin, has been doing for many years now, the Asthma Files, or more recently, the Platform for Experimental Collaborative Ethnography. So, just to bring my introduction to a close, I think, by offering sort of very quick, very selective overview of what anthropologists have been doing, and this is just a sample. Anthropologists have been doing, anthropologists have been thinking about rethinking, designing, redesigning the nature of their own social, ethnographic, and epistemic practices with other people through infrastructures, through archives over the last 20 years. I'd like to open up a series of questions which lead us to think, or to ask ourselves not just how we produce data, right? Whether the nature of ethnography or anthropology is about producing data or not producing data, whether when we get the mandate from others, say policymakers or university administrators, to turn our knowledge into data. So I'd like to shift focus, shift attention from those questions, and also shift away from ideas that we're being compelled to upload our data or our knowledge into other people's archives. So this idea that the archive is something external to the discipline, something that others have been designing for us, etc. So these ideas that data is another, and then the archive is another, and that access is another, right? The regulations, the protocols, the requirements about access are another thing that we have to relate to. To shift focus from those ideas to actually bring to the fore that data, archiving, and access are integrally embedded in the everyday practice of anthropological anthropological practice of anthropological fieldwork, and that not reckoning with that fact, and if we insist in framing the questions that it's others who are, It's others' exigencies and others' requirements and others' policy mandates that encroach upon our own practices. If we insist in framing things from that point of view, that framing it's apolitical framing, and we are shying away from confronting head-on crucial questions about how do we want to train our future anthropologists. Who do we need to train them in accompaniment with? We need the help of librarians, of archivists, of data specialists. These are all conversations and collaborations and alliances that we need to, these are people we need to rethink the design of anthropology in the 21st century. How is it possible, and I'll finish with two questions, one of them a little bit polemical. How is it possible that almost 20 years from the Budapest Open Access Declaration, most anthropology journals are published on proprietary platforms, behind paywalls, and under restrictive licensing and sharing terms? We know, I've already given you some examples, that both the infrastructure, both the licensing agreements, and let alone the financial requirements are, it's possible to imagine an anthropology beyond, those terms of production. How is it possible, and this is my polemical question, that only this year, the Royal Anthropological Institute signed a contract to have its archives, including the Malinowski archive, digitized and commercialized by Wiley for the next 12 years. The types of path dependencies that is going to generate on those archives are so restrictive that never ever again will those materials be in the open and public domain.